when you give me. Welcome to the ALCTS webinar, Research Data Management Best Practices and REDCap. I'm Maria Pincus from the Health Sciences and Human Services Library of the University of Maryland in Baltimore, and a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter for today is Dr. Paul A. Harris. Dr. Harris is Professor of Biomedical Informatics and Biomedical Engineering, who has approximately 20 years' experience working in the field of clinical research informatics. He earned his doctorate in biomedical engineering from Vanderbilt University and now serves as director for Vanderbilt's Office of Research Informatics. He devised and created REDCap, a research data collection and management software platform that has been adopted by 2,130 academic and nonprofit institutions in 108 countries. There are a few things to keep in mind for today's presentation. All attendees are muted. If you have questions for Paul, please type them into the question box on your screen, and he will answer them at the end of the presentation. Our software does not have interactive chat capabilities. You may use the ALCTS hashtag if you wish to use Twitter to comment on today's presentation. The hashtag is in bold on the screen. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so please use the question box to submit questions and comments. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides. And now, as the presentation privileges on to Paul, there may be a slight delay.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Paul Harris, and my topic today is Research Data Management, Best Practices, and REDCap. I'm excited to have this opportunity and really appreciate the opportunity to present today. As mentioned earlier, we'll take questions at the end of the presentation. I also want to say up front that we will have my email will be posted at the end, and I'll take any questions that can't be answered today after the fact by email. So this talk really is about a topic that's near and dear to me, REDCap and data management. And really, REDCap, the platform, was built out of years of experience working with research teams in all types of disciplines and domains. As I'll mention in my talk, I have a special affinity for librarians and information scientists, and REDCap, the platform, as well as some of my best practices, came directly from working with this population. The reason we decided on this topic for this forum is that librarians are increasingly involved in guiding researchers in data management. This seems to be something I present from time to time in various forums, and this seems to be actually a growing phenomenon. I know it is here at Vanderbilt University. As part of that, being able to provide guidance to researchers and training is something that often falls within the purview of knowledge management experts and librarians. So I assembled some guidelines for data management that I'll present. I hope you'll find it interesting, and then at the conclusion of the guidelines or the best practices, I want to provide a tool, a not-for-profit data management tool that we've developed at Vanderbilt and disseminated for use at no cost to any academic, nonprofit, or government organization in the world. And that dissemination has gone really well, and with that, it's brought a lot of use cases and a lot of interesting folks to us, and that actually improves our ability to listen for interesting use cases and to develop more of these best practices. So I'm going to give a very short demo of a few slides talking about conceptual issues that you should keep in mind when doing data management planning and implementation. First piece of advice and the concept that I have that is probably most important is remember this this principle that we've all kind of heard about, at least if we grew up in the U.S. I think in all regions of the country, you know, there's some variation of the phrasing of garbage in, garbage out. You know, meaning that usually we're going to, if we invest on the front end, there'll be dividends on the back end. That is very true in the data management world. I've seen really good ideas scientifically come to near ruin because people try to rush the data planning up front. While I think good data planning won't win you a Nobel Prize if you have a lousy scientific idea, I do think that that if you have a great scientific idea, bad data management can basically sabotage your efforts. So spend the time up front, and there's good dividends downstream. I also teach in my courses that this is not just a good idea. It's really about ethics. No matter what type of research you're doing, whether it be basic research or patient-oriented research, as I mainly do, you're putting considerable time and effort and energy into a project, and oftentimes funding. In the case of patient studies, you know, we're also putting you know the trust of our patient population is a factor. And so by not doing adequate planning up front, and basically we're not going to be getting maximal scientific benefit from the study. So I really train this as an ethics principle, that doing it right is not only a good idea, it's really mandatory. This is probably my favorite best practice, and this one comes from a whole lot of meetings that I've done with a whole lot of big shots at my university and elsewhere. You know, I'll get a meeting request sometimes, and it always kind of sounds like this. We've got a Dr. such and such wants to have a meeting with you in his lab, and they've got this great idea that they want to explore. And I always know what the idea is based on the wording that goes into that invite. And I show up at the meeting, and the idea is typically we want to build a huge registry. And that registry is we're going to, you know, we just want to measure everything on everyone that comes through the door, and we're going to use it for research, and we're going to use it for operational improvement. We're going to use it for, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And I usually ask questions about, you know, well, who's going to be using it? Well, everyone's going to be using it. What's the most important thing that you want to gather here? Or what's the most important outcome here? And you know, everything is going to be important. And usually, you know, I sort of chuckle to myself that what I really want to say is, yeah, I guess we could build that thing, but guess what it's going to cost? Everything. But because you really can't do all things for all people in all situations. And one of the adages of data management is if you try to care about all of the data, you end up caring about none of it, because there's no way that you can afford to do the quality and really the rigor of good data management if you don't really know what you're looking for. So I always recommend that people stay very close to the principle of developing a primary hypothesis, designing the data management and collection around that, and maybe a secondary outcome or two to test the hypothesis, but really don't go on just fishing expeditions. This practice is really an important one, and that is when collecting data or when thinking about collecting data, be really exact and discrete when defining variables. I had a study team once that came to me and said, you know, really this is going to be a simple study, 2 visits, and each visit has an MRI and a metabolic panel. And can you build a database for this? And you know, I started asking questions about, you know, what's in a metabolic panel and what are the units there, and how can we, you know, what are you going to be doing with that MRI, and is that some sort of a tumor diameter or something? And you know, let's turn that into structured data forms. And by the time that group left my office, they had about 60 variables, and they were pretty amazed. By the time we started that study, I think we had about 400 variables that were going to be collected across those 2 visits. And they did it right. But the way they did it right was we really made them get down in the weeds and start thinking very exact and very discrete on what you're going to be collecting and what you're going to be measuring. I've found that asking for representative values and units really helps that thinking along. It's good practice to ask categorical values like gender, male, female, education, as you see here. From a statistics and an analysis standpoint, it's a good idea also to code those variables. And if you're going to code those variables, it's really important that you keep a code book and that you're consistent with the coding throughout the study. It's a good idea to think about confounding factors. This kind of goes against the principle that I mentioned early on about being very focused in on that primary outcome and hypothesis. There are things like race, gender, ethnicity, and so forth that when you put them into the final analysis, they really are, they really should be considered as confounding factors, and they will be important in the analysis. So I really recommend thinking hard about the confounding factors. DNA is a great example here in that you may think you have all of the genetic SNPs or what have you that might play a factor in whether an individual is susceptible to pain or not, or maybe responsive to a certain drug or not. But in the world of genetics, as you most certainly know, there are new discoveries every day, and so being able to sort of keep those samples with IRB approval so that that could be used as confounding factors as well. It's important to think about missing data. So this one sounds easy at face value, but in reality, a missing value from a case report form or a survey, if you're doing patient-reported outcome work, is not really always a missing value. Sometimes it's the patient doesn't remember. Sometimes the patient knows, but they won't tell me. So those are different when you get into analysis, and so being able to sort of code into your data plans the reason for missing this, or even the level of ambiguity, as you can see in the wording at the bottom of the screen. The dates are particularly problematic in terms of ambiguity. When were you diagnosed with this disease? Some people will know it to a day. Some people may not know it to a decade. And so being careful about that, because if you're not careful about it, encoding that ambiguity, so sometimes you really don't have a way to represent, and you lose information there. Data sharing and exchange is a huge topic these days, as this group, I think, of all groups would know. To share data, it requires 2 things. It requires data, and it requires information about the data. So I could sit here and spout numbers off at you, during this webinar, but if I don't give you a context for that information, then really it does no good. So being able to share data requires well-defined data dictionaries, and really doing good science, doing good anything, really requires standard operating procedures. And so thinking about that and planning for that up front, again, is part of that investment on the front end that pays off downstream. If we're collecting data electronically, then we have a bit of an advantage. So that advantage might be that unlike a piece of paper where if I'm asking you to put down a number between 0 and 100, my piece of paper doesn't really know if I mess that up or not and put 1,000 in. But if I'm designing electronic software, I can very easily code in ways so that I could check the data type. Hey, that's not a number at all. Or thanks for the number, but that's outside of the range that was previously specified. So there are things like that. Double data entry, this is a process where you might have 2 data entry people putting in the exact same information, and if you're really wanting to be careful about errors, you can have them have sort of shadow systems, duplicate systems that they're entering data in, and then the computer software can compare the answers with the idea of harmonization. And the basic principle of that is that those individuals will make mistakes, but it's unlikely that they're going to make the same mistake on the same field. So there are all sorts of things that we can add in if we're doing electronic data capture. It's extremely important and getting more important in all sorts of research, but especially clinical and translational research, to keep audit trails of all data changes. On paper again, in the clinical trials world, this looks like a paper case report form. You're always going to write in ink. If you make a change, you never use whiteout, and you line through it, and you initial, and maybe even give a reason for that change. A lot of people forget that when they move over into the electronic form of data capture and collection. But keeping audit trails of all data changes, keeping logs of who added, changed, or even viewed data, these are all principles within HIPAA, the HIPAA security rules, and how we're going to treat data when we're collecting it electronically. So this is usually where I actually have a whole slide deck that I usually give on best practices, and this is just sort of a few that I've pulled out. But I've actually hopefully kind of taken you from the very easy, hey, think about things before you start collecting data, to what may be quite difficult for you to think about. Build in audit trails for who did what, and maybe even why changes were made to the data, who viewed the data. Those are very important principles. These are pretty easy to conceive. These are kind of hard to conceive if you're not used to building or using electronic systems. And so this is usually where I kind of stop and say this is kind of if you don't have the tools to actually follow through with best practices, then you get this kind of cognitive dissonance. And I've been to a lot of talks before where people will tell me all of the great theory and this is what you should be doing, but I leave those talks and sometimes and I think, yeah, but I don't have the tools to do it better. All I really know now is that that I'm sort of not measuring up. So in my classes for data management and training here at Vanderbilt and in short courses and work groups across various domains, usually this is kind of a jumping off point for explaining, well, this is actually why we created a software platform with the idea that that we can teach you best practices. And if you'll follow, at least our Vanderbilt researchers, we encourage them to follow. Go ahead and use this new platform, or the platform we have called REDCap. And basically, a lot of the best practices are already kind of baked into the creation and the implementation phases. Before I forget, I mentioned that I have a whole slide deck. We actually have a whole MOOC, a massive open online course that kind of starts in these best practices. And then the learning exercises are in this REDCap platform. So if you want to see that whole deck, videos of that whole deck, or if you want to, sort of think about going deeper here, this is about a 5 or 6 week course with minimal, 2 or 3 hour investment per week, and it's free via this Coursera platform. And you can see the URL up here. So I encourage you to go there if that's of interest. So, but let me sort of use that jumping off point to talk a bit about REDCap. REDCap stands for Research Electronic Data Capture. It is a software platform, and it really started way back in 2004. There were a lot of things going on in the world in 2004, and as I sort of did my scan of the what's happening now, some time ago when creating this talk, recognized that Lance Armstrong was still riding a bike, and the Red Sox broke the curse, and there was this guy at Harvard that created this other platform called Facebook. A lot of stuff going on, but none of that really influenced REDCap. What influenced REDCap was this thing that I mentioned earlier called HIPAA security rules. We were all familiar with HIPAA privacy rules. The HIPAA security rules really sort of get into the weeds of if you are going to be collecting and managing and disseminating data electronically, then there are a whole other set of rules that you need to follow. And this is where you get into those audit trails and some of those best practices that we mentioned. When I looked across Vanderbilt University at the time, and looked at the current state of what really good researchers were doing and what they should be doing in this desired state, what I realized was that we're way far off, and we have thousands of concurrent projects going on here at Vanderbilt in the research domain, and I can't hire enough programmers. They don't have enough money, and I I can't hire, and I'm not interested in hiring enough programmers to fix this on a study-by-study basis. And so really the notion that I had at the time was that if we could build one set of software and we could describe computationally in a database, if you will, if we could describe the data about the data for a particular study, then all we would need to do to sort of customize the data collection platform for each study would be to replace that metadata or that data about the data. So I set about to create the screens and the modules. Here's the first one that we created. Just getting good, solid, data in is key. So over time we evolved things, etc. But even in the very beginning of REDCap, there was, if I know the data about your study, and that can be completely flexible and customized for your study, if I can get that metadata, then I can put together case report forms, as you see here, that would have human readable labels, different types of field types, different ways to ask questions with coding in the background, of course. And I can do that all in a relatively simple way, just without writing programs for this particular project, but using the whole platform with just the metadata about that particular study or project. Of course, if you can get good data in, the next thing you need to do is get good data out. And so the next module that I kind of went to work on was this data export module, where not only can we get data out, but we can get data out and going back to that contextual sort of sharing. I know the metadata. I know that this was the pretty human label for this question, and I know that to do something with that, I know that I've got coded variables, and I've got I know the context of those, and so I can wrap up the data that's exported with the metadata itself, and I can export that into SPSS and SAS and Stata and all kinds of different statistics package. In my other roles at Vanderbilt, I work a lot with big data, so we realized, hey, de-identifying this data on the way out for sharing is also a good idea, and so we created some of that in this module. So I'm going to get back to, in just a moment, the core principles and some of the story behind REDCap, but I thought now I just kind of stop for just a moment and do a quick demonstration. REDCap, if you want to know about the larger program, you can go to Project REDCap. That's our public page, and it will show you that over time we started disseminating this outside of Vanderbilt, and we have lots of institutions across lots of countries and so forth. And this is actually where you kind of come to think about getting access to REDCap if you'd like it. There is a try REDCap version over here, and this will give you kind of a week-long login credentials to go in and just kind of kick the tires a bit. It's a web-based platform, and so the sharing really comes in when your institution joins the consortium and they can set up the software and for the basically disseminating to the research community locally. But I'm going to show you a quick demo rather than talking more about the consortium here. So now I'm logged into REDCap. If you see, I've already logged in and I'm authenticated to Vanderbilt's version of this. If I go to My Projects, you'll see that I am affiliated with lots of projects, and in this you'll see a lot of demo type work, and so you may also see that I don't come back and clean up as often as I should. But I think the ones you're seeing here are actually real bona fide projects. We're not going to spend a lot of time here in this screen, other than to say that across Vanderbilt we probably got more like 30,000 projects, and so it knows me as a user and it knows which projects I'm associated with. I'm going to create yet another project here for REDCap, just to kind of show you how easy it is. So I'll click Create New Project. This will be my demo for webinar. I'm just going to say this is practice for fun. I won't do any of the bookkeeping that I might otherwise do. And then I get this opportunity to either create an empty project, which is probably what we'll do, Or if I'm coming from, if I just left Vanderbilt and I'm going to Mayo Clinic and I want to take my study data with me, or at least my study metadata with me, there are export features that would allow me to share among my colleagues or to bring it with me. Or I could use a template. And again, we could look at the different templates, and we could see here that REDCap can be used for certainly the patient data studies, but it also is used increasingly for basic science and operational studies, etc. Again, I'm not going to choose any of those. I'll just kind of create an empty project. We'll create a case report form or two or a survey or two, and then we'll kind of come back to the PowerPoint. REDCap has a lot of features and functions beyond just the input screens and the export screens that I showed you earlier. You can see a lot of those over here. And it has, really has been designed from the ground up to be very easy to use by the research community, but also it packs a lot of complexity in if you need it for a study, like your randomization modules, queries. You can even tell it to not rely on screens so much, but use telephony, like text messaging to do surveys or voice calls, etc. I won't show you a lot of those features today in the interest of time, but I'll just kind of let you know that they're there. The first thing usually that we're going to do when we create some data management tools for a project is we're going to design data collection instruments. So I'll go to the online designer here, and you'll see that it's already chosen, it's already created one instrument for me. I can rename that, and let's say demographics. If I wanted to create another instrument, I would just create new. And again, I'm telling you this, but because I probably won't show it to you in detail. But let's go into the demographics. And the demographics here, I've got one field, record ID. This is the identifier for the participants. I can click Add Field here, and I can say something like first name. Because this is going into a database, and it will be going into analysis packages, I should probably choose something that's a little more computer friendly. If I don't want to choose that and I want REDCap to sort of guess and create it for me, I can click this button. Options that I have with a text box would be maybe going and saying, hey, wait a minute, let's make this a number. Doesn't make sense in this context, but you can see where if I were creating a field where I was collecting information and I wanted it to be a number, I could choose integer, and with that I get some more options. Make sure it's between 0 and 100, per our example earlier. So it's relatively easy. In this case, I'll say none. This group, I think will appreciate the fact that REDCap also plays well with biomedical ontologies, and so, if we wanted to sort of validate it against one of these ontologies, we could choose from any number of ontologies that sort of come in the base package as a connection to BioPortal that Stanford runs. I could do field notes, etc. I could click on identifier, and this would help us with the export features that will de-identify the data on the way out, but I'm just going to click Save. So now I've got first name. Let me add, that'll be all we need for first name. Let's do a gender. In this particular case, I don't really want you to type that in. I'd like you to choose from a drop-down list. If I'm going to say choose from a drop-down list, then I have to tell it the choices. And so I'll say this should be male, and this should be female. And you'll notice that the next thing REDCap does is said, okay, you're asking for categorical values. Maybe it would be a good idea for you to code these variables. And I'll choose some for you if you'd like. Now I could go in and I could say, well, really, to be consistent with every other study I've ever done, we've always coded it this way, and that will be fine. But the point is, everything is customizable, but REDCap tries to help you along the way. So we'll save here, and let's see. Let's ask a yes/no type question. Are you pregnant? Are you currently pregnant? Okay, so we've got 3 fields, and you know, we've actually created, as we've been going along, we've fleshed out this demographics field. If I decide for some reason, by the way, that I'd like to ask the first name question after gender, it just kind of has drag and drop that allows you to sort of move things around. If I wanted to go actually see this in action, it's already over here on the data collection piece, and I can actually go in and add a new record and say that this is Paul, and he's male and not currently pregnant. This is kind of interesting because if you remember we talked about the HIPAA piece and the audit trails. There are ways to sort of get at the audit trails in various ways, like the logging feature here. But one of the ways that you can see them real time would be clicking on this history button. So I can see that this user that was logged in named Harris PA actually entered that data at this particular time. So let me show you one more thing on the forms, and that would be branching logic. So if this is a demographics, this pregnancy question, it makes a lot of sense unless I choose male. So I'm going to click on this little branching logic area, and I'll say that I only want to ask that question if it's a female. You can be very sophisticated and even take answers from across case report forms or surveys there. This one's just very simple. But now I'll put in that this is Mary, and Mary is a male. And you see there is no question for pregnancy. But if I choose female, then I get to answer that question. So again, I'm not going to spend a lot more time on the demo, just kind of showing you that this is actually pretty easy to create. Given that I am talking to a librarian-centric group, I do want to talk a little bit about the REDCap shared library. And that would be sort of an answer to the question of, wouldn't it be great if I didn't have to create all of these case report forms, or you know, if I've got validated instruments out there, it would be wonderful if I could just take shared information there. We do have a library with curated content, so that if I'm looking for something like a depression inventory, and I'm coming from REDCap, you know, I can choose here. I could view that as it's going to look in REDCap, or I could import it into my REDCap project. Here I need to agree to the terms of use, and I would just add it to my study this way. And now I have 2 case report forms, one for demographics that we saw earlier, and now for this Hamilton Depression Rating Scale. So again, there's a lot more to show you in REDCap as a demo, but I think we'll stop there with the suggestion that if you'd like to play around with it, if you'll just go to the link that I'm showing on the demo screen here, there is a 1-week demo account that you can create there, and you can play with it to your heart's content. So let me go back into the sort of the story of REDCap, because I think I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the model, and then end with some real-world examples, especially some contributions from our information science and knowledge management community. So one of the cool things that we saw about REDCap from the beginning was that you know, it really empowered our researchers. It filled this really critical gap at Vanderbilt, and it provided this easy way to do the right thing with you know, in terms of HIPAA security and so forth. In the early days, we started REDCap in 2004 in August. By the end of the year, we were supporting 20 projects using this metadata creation, you know, flexible process, which is a pretty modest number, but if you were used to building custom software for projects, it's a pretty big deal. Yeah, you know, being able to support 20 at a time with no very little programming on a study-by-study basis. So I did this quick little survey and just see how things were going, and is it too hard, and we got really great feedback. But one of the things that I was most impressed with was I asked this question: did it improve your science? And the answer to that was unanimously, yes, it improved our science. And I felt really great about that for a few days, but I just kept thinking about it, and the fact that, you know, really these widgets on the screen really aren't improving their science. I think what they're really telling me, and I've since confirmed this, is what they're telling me is that actually putting the power of creating our own studies and not having to sort of have a programmer or you know, any type of expert kind of translating that into practice. That really empowered the research community, and what we found was that, you know, really smart people do really smart things when you give them tools, and it's easy enough to use. So again, you know, it really that really impressed me a lot early on, and it really continues to impress me that you know, you give solid tools to folks and get out of the way, and really, you know, that is what was improving the science. But here's sort of the flip side of that. Early on, I did a lot of interviews with researchers and telling them about this new great platform, and you should use it, and here's why you should use it. And I would go through this 45-minute sales pitch, and in that sales pitch, you know, usually they would say, yeah, I've got to have it, and then we'd kind of talk about the next steps. But every single time almost, there would be questions. You know, it's really fantastic, but will it do this? Or could you add some sort of other widget to do something else? And getting that continuous feedback from real end users, it was and is huge. You know, it really helps us to kind of listen to what's really important out there in the researcher community. So that power goes both ways. Used systems get better, and you know, that's what we found to be one of the main benefits to disseminating it even outside of Vanderbilt. So at Vanderbilt, I pulled these numbers just last week, I think. We're up to 40,000 projects now. 15,000 of those are in production, and you can sort of see, you know, a lot of projects are not research-oriented anymore. A lot of operational stuff, a lot of quality stuff, and even within research, we have this sort of the whole spectrum of clinical and translational research being done, you know, using that REDCap platform. At any time given you know, a normal weekday, we're probably looking at about 500 concurrent users. And this is where all of the people logged in to REDCap, our version of REDCap, just here at Vanderbilt last week. So you can tell there that, you know, we're doing a lot of multi-center, multi-institution, and even multi-country studies here at Vanderbilt using this platform. And I really like to show this because I think, you know, while it can be the perfect tool for a very small, very lightweight study, it can also be very robust, and what we found is that, you know, it's best when thought about as a research enterprise platform. So you know, sort of continuing the story of the collaboration, you know, back in 2006, I was giving a talk and just sort of invited, and you know, this is how we're solving this HIPAA security problem at Vanderbilt. You know, we've got this new cool tool and et cetera. And if you're interested in collaborating, you know, talk to me. And somebody did, and we created this this sort of really nice sharing model, this volunteerism-centric consortium where we do share the software at no cost, and we support, you know, the software at no cost, including the training of the informaticians at other institutions. But we do it because a lot of that support is actually on the shoulders of the consortium itself. So it's really, you know, I've worked with a lot of projects, a lot of consortia, a lot of networks, and this one's my favorite, really, because, you know, I've just seen so much, you know, ground level, grassroots support and community supporting community across this REDCap consortium. And now we're up to a little over 2,000 institutions across 108 countries, and the really cool thing about that is there's 434,000 end users. So kind of going back to the used systems get better, you know, you'd be amazed at the number of use cases and the good ideas that come from 418,000 end users. So yeah, just want to finish up with a few comments today before we take questions. I would just want to finish up with a few comments sort of centered around this. Give smart people really solid, flexible, you know, Swiss Army knife-like tools like REDCap, and you get a lot of power. We don't know what's happening in terms of the research conducted at all of those 2,000 other institutions, but we do pay pretty close attention when people cite using REDCap in a methods paper. And so we've been able to collect, you know, what I think is probably a conservative estimate of the number of studies and papers, published manuscripts that have leveraged REDCap, and it's, you know, getting close to 2,000, getting close to 3,000 there. And what impresses me, and you can find these a list of these on that public website that I mentioned earlier, but what impresses me about that is really the diversity there. In the REDCap consortium, we have a lot of academic medical centers, of course, but we also have fisheries in Australia, and I think the Cleveland Museum of Art is a REDCap member institution. So lots and lots of different use cases that sort of speak to this principle of solid tools, smart people do amazing things. One of those amazing people here at Vanderbilt is Tanea Kuntz. She is a Vanderbilt information scientist. I get to work with her quite a bit, particularly when she's got an exciting new project and she's got a question. I think I'm on her speed dial list. But I asked her a little bit about her use of REDCap, recent use of REDCap, and asked her if it would be okay to talk a little bit about that during this conversation. In so doing, I realized that she's got 73 projects that she's using REDCap for. The one I'll highlight is probably the most recent publication where she and others were conducting feasibility studies for IOM recommended panel of social and behavioral determinants of health. And as a leveraging piece of that, they coded everything up in REDCap. This is where they did their questionnaire. And because REDCap is used at many other institutions, we were able to sort of use it as a, hey, if you want to use that questionnaire, here's a sharing mechanism for that. I want to highlight some contributions from a few other librarians. Fatima Barnes from Howard University and Jennifer Lyon, who is now at Stony Brook, and as well as one of our core leaders here at Vanderbilt, Brenda Miner, that they are actually the ones responsible for a lot of that instrument shared library that I showed you earlier, and just recently published a chapter in the book that you see over here on the left, and the title of the article that you see on the right. I've got one more interesting use case, and in the interest of time, I won't go into this one. But this is probably my favorite REDCap use case of all time. I took this picture down in Johannesburg, South Africa, a couple of months ago. This is a group, epidemiology type group, that's studying really conditions and sort of baseline characteristics and health status, as well as abuse status of sex workers in South Africa. So this is really a vulnerable population. These individuals that you see here, most of them have no formal academic training, but they ask some of the best REDCap questions I've ever heard, and for me at least, it was just sort of speaking to the fact that you really don't have to be an informatician to do good work in this space, as long as you have good tools and really good minds to basically leverage. So I believe that I think I'm about 20 to 30 seconds early in terms of finishing up what I wanted to finish up before questions. But this would be a great time, I think, to open up the door and answer any questions that you might have specifically. And I want to again sort of point out, in case we forget later, this is my email address that you see in the bottom right-hand corner, and be happy to get emails offline from individuals if you have more complex questions. So I'll turn it back over and see if there are any questions that we should be addressing.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, for sharing with us your expertise in data management and introducing us to REDCap. Librarians in our role as facilitators for the research enterprise have now more knowledge of one more possible tool to recommend for data collection depending on the needs of our constituents. We have some knowledge on research data management that will facilitate our integration in that process. Now we have a couple of questions for you. I encourage all of the attendees to submit additional questions and comments using the question box. If we do not have time to answer all of them, Paul will answer them offline, and questions and answers will be sent to the participants. First question that we have: is REDCap meant to be used primarily or exclusively by health sciences or medical institutions, or have you had other kinds of institutions adopt it? I think this is something that you sort of answered during the presentation.
Yeah, that's a great question, and while while we definitely started REDCap to support clinical and translational research, really we started REDCap to support clinical research. But one of the key findings early on was that really smart people wanted to use it for basic science, and I thought about that and realized that this is just a big dumb database, and it really doesn't know or care whether the sort of the data record is pertaining to a person or maybe a mouse or a test tube. So we've kept it pretty generic in terms of the specificity, and we've tried not to make REDCap the all-in-all phase 3 clinical trial platform, but instead tried to keep things neutral and generalized. And so for that reason, we do have a lot of people, even outside of research now, that are using REDCap for all kinds of different purposes.
Thank you, Paul. Who typically approaches you to implement REDCap in their institutions? Researchers, informatics folks, librarians?
Yeah, so usually it could come from two sources. Usually we will get inquiry through our website, and I'll say this has changed over time. I used to get a lot of individual emails on this, and a lot of times it was coming directly from researchers, and so for that reason, we created online functionality to basically shepherd the process of joining and getting REDCap. So I would say a researcher or a researcher team might be the actual initiators of the activity that I'll kind of show you here, but usually it's by the time it gets to us as a request, it's an informatics or a technology group that may be driven by researchers or maybe be driven by institutional leaders saying, hey, we should check out this platform. Usually the types of questions that we get early on are going to be answered in this public website, like the software technology requirements. This will kind of tell you what's needed there. And then down at the bottom there is an end user license agreement. It is free to academics, nonprofits, and government organizations, but we do require a licensing agreement. And so just kind of clicking here, that institutional individual will then go in and fill out, of course, a REDCap survey about their organization and their intended use. And then once these questions are filled out, the license agreement is shown. So it's a relatively painless process. What happens next is that we'll get that license agreement. We'll ask for the contact information for the technology individuals and the people that are going to be sort of locally setting it up, and then we kind of onboard those into some consortium resources and kind of give them the software and get them into the train-the-trainer model. Great question, and happy to follow up again on that later on if anybody has more detailed questions on that topic.
Our next question is, how can REDCap be used to import and code Qualtrics surveys questions into variables?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Qualtrics is another platform. It's a vendor solution. And honestly, I've not used Qualtrics personally. I understand it's a good platform. I think, really you'd probably be using either or. If you wanted to translate the questions and the answers and the collection instruments over into REDCap, you could do just that. You could create the REDCap database or survey instruments just as I showed you a moment ago. And I'm going to go back to that screen for just a moment. So we didn't create any of these as surveys, but if I wanted to create surveys that could be sort of publicly available or by invitation, and this would get into some of the Qualtrics type world, you could just click this button here. And if I'm doing that online designer, I can enable as a survey, and then you get some functionality over here. that sort of morphs and changes based on the fact that you're doing survey work. If you've got an existing study that's already using Qualtrics, and if the question there is, how do I translate that over to REDCap? I don't know that there is sort of a turnkey solution for that. If you wanted to, for whatever reason, if you wanted to do that, I would say you would create the instruments that in the manner that I was showing you earlier, making sure that you're coding the same way. And then REDCap has a data import tool that will allow you, based on the metadata already known about your study, it will allow you to import records. And then there are various ways of doing that as well. So I'm not sure if I answered that question completely. I answered it to the best of my ability for what I understand the question to be.
Here's like an inverse of that question. How can you share a REDCap study across platforms?
So I'll answer that two ways. So if you're talking about sharing it with another REDCap institution, again, let's say Vanderbilt and Stanford are doing a study together. One of the things that I didn't mention is if we're doing the study together and it makes sense for Stanford to be the data coordinating center here and really to use the Stanford REDCap for collection of data, even with the Vanderbilt folks putting their information into the Stanford system. REDCap is pretty good at that, and you can sort of use these data access groups and some functionality to make that happen. So it may be that in that particular case, if you were doing a multi-center study with one data coordinating center, you wouldn't really have to share that across institutions, other than maybe sharing the data with the data exports, which you would get to here. If another way to answer that question would be, or another way to phrase a question related would be, hey, but really it makes sense for Vanderbilt to be collecting the data, and it makes sense for Stanford to be collecting the data locally, because we want to add some extra variables that are context and locally sensitive, or politically it makes more sense to do it that way. But we also want to standardize things, and so we don't want to duplicate effort. So the way that you would do that is you would create, whoever is going to be sort of the study creator, you would create your REDCap study, as we've been mentioning earlier. And there are ways to download, in this particular case, I can download an instrument that I've created, zip that up, and send it to my colleagues at Stanford. There are also ways, I won't go to the trouble of going in and grabbing this, but there are also ways to get the entire metadata, all studies, all visits, all kinds of different parameters, and sort of share those in one file that can then be uploaded, as we saw here. If I were creating another project, upload the REDCap project XML file, and that one could actually bring not only the metadata about the instruments and so forth, but if you'd like, you can actually export the data itself, so you could share the whole thing with another REDCap install. The third answer to that question, if you're asking about, how could I move from REDCap to Qualtrics, again, it would sort of be the inverse of what we were talking about earlier. You first have to create your instruments or whatever you're going to be doing over in Qualtrics, or whatever system you're going to be using, and you'd have to export it from REDCap and then import. We don't have a lot of people doing that, so it doesn't really make sense to create a lot of functionality around that. While we're on that general topic of sort of sharing data, though, I do want to talk about one other piece, and then we'll go back to the questions. If I'm in any of my studies, this one's how we actually track our candidate interviews for new jobs, and so I won't show you the records for that and those assessments, but I'm just opening up a generic REDCap project to talk a little bit about the API. This gets very, very technical, and I won't go there. But the API functionality allows you to have systems talking with other systems, and with the appropriate access rights, and you kind of see how you get those here. If you have computer programmers or statisticians that want to pull the data or even push the data from or to REDCap using a computer program. All of that's functional, and you can do that without even going to the interface. This is kind of an advanced topic for techies, but what I've seen is that for integration and interoperability work, it's absolutely amazing what people can use with these sort of open tunnels and secure tunnels to the system and system data. Let me stop there and see if there are other questions.
I have a question. When you speak about data management, there's often what will come to mind will be big data.
Right.
And does REDCap have any capabilities of storing big data or of linking to a big data storage platform?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I didn't provide a lot of overview or background information on myself, but my role here at Vanderbilt is the director of the Office of Research Informatics. And so as part of that, I have a group that basically is the big data team for research. And we pull data of all sorts out of the electronic health record, and we put it in a data warehouse for research purposes. And so there are any number of intersection points with REDCap here locally at Vanderbilt and different use cases. And some of those have been built out to be supported of the consortium. So one of those might be I'd like to leverage the data that's captured clinically, and I'd like to pull it into REDCap in a context-sensitive way. Another one might be, hey, I've got a I'm using my query tools for my big data enterprise, and my next step is usually I'd like to have a data mart. I'd like to have sort of a secure place to keep that data, and then maybe even add on to that. What we found is REDCap makes a great receptacle to that. So it's kind of complementary to the big data side, but it can also feed. So you can imagine that big data is really lots of little data sort of put together. So if you could imagine that if I have clinical records on 1.5 million people, and if I have a REDCap database that's a really nice registry on 1,000 of those people, being able to sort of figure out a way to merge data sets and so forth. This kind of gets out of the collection and management within REDCap that we're talking about, but well-curated data is well-curated data. So being able to sort of get it out either using the export or even the API functions that I just mentioned. Those are ways, those are just a few ways that REDCap can sort of bridge that small data to big data gap. I actually have a talk on that very topic and title. So there's interesting things to do there.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Paul. This will be this is the last question that we have for now, and it's time to go to our closing comments. I want to start by thanking everybody, all of the people who are attending here today. And our presenter, Paul Harris, for such an excellent presentation. We also want to thank the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, Technical Support Subcommittee. Joseph Nicholson and Wanda Pittman-Jazayeri have been here today, as well as the ALCTS Office Liaison, Megan Dougherty. What's coming up is for winter and spring of 2017. We don't have the exact dates at this point. Just watch out for the listservs and the website, the ALCTS website. But we have a webinar on cataloging, gender, and RDA Rule 9.7, and a 2-part series on Library of Congress subject headings, as well as a 5-part series on re-envisioning technical services. This 5-part series is based on the successful 2016 Midwinter Symposium held in Boston. So details and dates will be available on the ALCTS website soon. ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, and e-forums, which are 2-day email discussions open to all, members and non-members. Watch out for a possible e-forum on ILS optimization on January 17 and 18, 2017. You'll find more information on web courses and e-forums on the ALCTS website. We hope you will participate in other ALCTS continuing education offerings again in the future. This concludes our session. Thank you again for joining us.